But to this now, the COVID-19 pandemic has generated a lot of media coverage, and there have been conflicting reports on the effectiveness of lockdown, social distancing and masks. Well, it's perhaps not surprising that the media is under so much scrutiny and the spotlight for the way it has reported on the spread of the deadly virus. But joining us now via Skype is independent author Nechama Brody as we take a look on the impact and role of mass media during this crisis. Nechama, thank you so much for your time and welcome to ENCA. I mean, I suppose we should start off with how the media, mass media particularly, has been reporting on COVID-19, not just only in the country, but giving more of a global outlook.
So I think what we've seen is that the way media has covered the pandemic has changed significantly over time. And I'd like to focus on South Africa because different countries have had quite significantly different media coverage, largely in response to or depending on the way their governments have handled it. So we've seen in countries where there's been a lot of confidence in the government response, so New Zealand, for example, that media has been very positive. Because there the media's role is not to push back against the government's actions, but to really sort of encourage people to comply with what everybody seems to agree is a good response. In other countries where the responses are failing or not achieving the same levels of success, and we could pretty much say that's most countries in the world, but particularly the United States, the United Kingdom right now, there's been a very different media response to how the government has been handling the COVID crisis. And what we saw in South Africa was that at the start of the lockdown and sort of in the first few weeks, there was a very positive pro-Cyril sentiment. And when I say pro-Cyril, I mean pro-government, but particularly it was centered around the president as sort of, you know, my fellow South Africans. He was the centerpiece for how we felt about the pandemic, and we felt that we trusted in that. And what we saw towards the end of April and the start of May, as the lockdown was extended and then the lockdown regulations were changed, was this coverage started to shift significantly, and we started to see an increasing amount of coverage that was very critical of the government's handling and that was no longer trusting in the government.
I mean, when we look at South Africa, for instance, do you think that the media has been able to reach every corner of the country? I'm talking here about remote areas, especially in a country that has 11 official languages. Has the language barrier also been overcome? Because, I mean, a survey was conducted recently and young people were saying they still haven't gotten enough information for them to know if they can make, you know, out of this pandemic, or if they feel that they won't be able to study further because of the lockdown or the pandemic, or some of them say that they're even scared to test, really.
I think that's a different question, but media never reaches every single corner, and it doesn't reach every person with the same message. And I think that's what's been important for me to try and track over the last 3 weeks in May in particular, is that I think as journalists we often make the mistake by thinking that Twitter represents the real world, or what we see online or on social media represents the real world, and it doesn't. It represents the portion of the world that we're comfortable with and that we inhabit. So what causes a massive outrage or what generates lots of clicks on Twitter or on Facebook only corresponds really to what people on Twitter or on Facebook are feeling. It doesn't have any correspondence to the rest of the country. And we can see that in terms of information not reaching people. But again, what we can see there is that those social media-driven news clicks, if we want to call it that, tend to thrive on outrage. So we've seen a lot more of outrage-type journalism and opinion pieces.
Right. Nechama, I want to ask you in terms of censorship. Have you ever, I don't know, come across a sense in the country or even globally on censorship with dealing with or the handling of journalists when it comes to COVID-19? There were theories in the beginning when, you know, COVID-19 or coronavirus was first detected in Wuhan, when one particular doctor was rather, you know, confirmed to have contracted COVID-19, but reports coming in there saying that there might have been cases of censorship around him trying to tell the Chinese government that there is a dangerous virus there looming. Have we been seeing that in other parts of the country or even the world?
Okay, so let's look at South Africa first. So I work as an academic. I teach journalism, I study media. but I've also been a journalist and an editor for nearly 25 years. And in my experience and from my perspective, there is no censorship in South Africa, not in the classic sort of apartheid state sort of way. We censor ideas for different reasons, but that's not done by the state. So in South Africa, no. And I know that there are groups of people online who will argue otherwise, that their ideas are being censored, but really they're just being deplatformed because they're right-wing and their ideas are hateful. We do see in many other countries, however, where media freedoms are not free, that censorship does take place, and this predated COVID to a large degree. So we know that in China, all media platforms are closely monitored, that censorship to some extent, or at least state interference, definitely takes place. We see that in other countries like Brazil. We are seeing it to some extent across Africa, where journalists are being threatened for covering COVID stories. We have had one instance, at least in South Africa, where a journalist was threatened by police. And if you go and look at the SANEF, the National Editors Forum, and other media freedom organizations, they do discuss where journalists' work are being interfered with. But there are states that already had pre-existing problems with media freedom, where we see those come into play a lot more now during COVID, because they don't want the media telling, I suppose, the real story.
All right, then we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much. Independent author Nagama Brody joining me right here on ENCA.